Long before modern medicine, before laboratories and vaccines, disease was already shaping the fate of civilizations. Some epidemics attacked the human body directly. Others moved more quietly through the world, striking the animals that sustained human life. Among the most devastating of these was a forgotten enemy of history, a virus that did not seek humans, yet changed the course of human survival. This was the story of Rinderpest, the cattle plague. For thousands of years, cattle were more than animals. They were food, labor, wealth, and survival. Entire agricultural systems depended on their strength. Milk nourished children. Oxen pulled plows through the soil. Herds represented stability in an uncertain world. But when disease struck these animals, it did not only kill livestock, it shattered the foundations of societies. Rinderpest spread with terrifying speed. A single infected animal could carry the virus across entire regions. Fever, weakness, and devastating internal infections followed. Within days, entire herds could collapse. Villages that depended on cattle suddenly faced famine, poverty, and fear. An animal disease had become a human crisis. Across centuries, the cattle plague moved silently through trade routes, migrating herds and marching armies. Empires rose and fell while the virus traveled unseen among animals. In some regions, it wiped out nearly all cattle, transforming landscapes, collapsing economies, and reshaping ecosystems. Few diseases in history possessed such quiet power. This is not only the story of a virus. It is the story of the fragile connection between humans, animals, and the natural world. A reminder that civilization itself can depend on the health of creatures that rarely appear in our history books. And it is a story that would eventually lead humanity toward one of the greatest scientific victories in history. Imagine a world where the survival of entire civilizations depends on a single animal. Long before engines, tractors, and industrial agriculture, human survival rested on muscle, hooves, and the slow rhythm of grazing herds. Across vast grasslands, fertile valleys, and ancient villages, cattle were not merely livestock, they were the foundation of daily life. Milk nourished children, hides became clothing and shelter, and powerful oxen pulled wooden plows through stubborn soil. In countless societies across Africa, Europe, and Asia, the strength of a nation could be measured not only by armies or cities, but by the size of its herds. Milk, meat, transportation, agriculture, and trade all began with cattle. They were the engines of the ancient world, converting grass into food, labor, and wealth. A single healthy herd could sustain an entire village. Fields could be planted, carts could travel across long distances, and communities could survive harsh winters and unpredictable droughts. In many cultures, cattle were more than economic assets. They were symbols of stability, prosperity, and life itself. But what happens when the animals that sustain civilization begin to vanish? What happens when disease moves silently through the herd, unseen at first, unnoticed, until suddenly the fields grow quiet and the barns stand empty? In a world built on cattle, the loss of a herd was not simply an agricultural disaster. It was the beginning of hunger, economic collapse, and fear. Long before modern medicine, long before laboratories could identify microscopic enemies, a silent force spread across continents. It traveled with migrating herds, merchant caravans, and marching armies. Invisible to the people who feared it, yet devastating to the animals they depended upon. This disease would become known as Rinderpest, the cattle plague. And here lies the strange paradox of this ancient epidemic. Rinderpest rarely infected humans. It did not sweep through cities like smallpox, nor did it strike villages like plague. Instead, it attacked the animals that made human survival possible. Yet through famine, economic collapse, and ecological disruption, this single virus would indirectly contribute to the deaths of millions. In the quiet fall of cattle, entire human worlds would begin to crumble. Rinderpest was one of the most contagious livestock diseases in history. Long before scientists could identify viruses or understand microscopic pathogens, farmers and herders already feared the devastating signs of this mysterious illness. Entire regions would suddenly watch their cattle weaken, collapse, and die. What people once described as a curse or divine punishment was, in reality, the work of a highly aggressive virus one that specialized in attacking hoofed animals and spreading rapidly through herds. Scientifically, Rinderpest was a viral disease belonging to the morbillivorous group, the same family of viruses that includes measles in humans. This connection reveals something remarkable about the biology of disease. Viruses that infect very different species can still share deep genetic relationships. The Rinderpest virus primarily targeted cattle, but it could also infect buffalo, yaks, and various wild-hoofed animals such as antelope and giraffes. Wherever large populations of grazing animals gathered, the virus could move swiftly and silently among them. The infection often began quietly. At first, an animal might simply appear tired or weak. Soon a high fever developed, draining its strength. The virus attacked the digestive system and immune defenses, leaving the body vulnerable to severe internal damage. Painful ulcers formed inside the mouth, making eating almost impossible. As the disease progressed, violent diarrhea caused extreme fluid loss, and dehydration slowly weakened the animal beyond recovery. What made Rinderpest truly terrifying was its speed. In densely packed herds, the virus could spread from animal to animal in a matter of hours. Within a few days, what had once been a healthy herd might be reduced to a field of dying animals. In some outbreaks, nearly every infected animal perished. Mortality rates in certain herds reached close to 100%, making the disease one of the deadliest livestock epidemics ever recorded. Yet the most unsettling aspect of Rinderpest was not only its lethality, it was the invisible chain reaction it created. A virus that attacked animals would ultimately reshape agriculture, trade, ecosystems, and human survival itself. To understand the true impact of Rinderpest, one must look beyond the biology of the virus and begin to explore how a disease of cattle could transform the fate of entire civilizations. Most historians trace the origins of Rinderpest to the vast grasslands of Central Asia. For thousands of years, these sweeping steppes supported enormous populations of grazing animals, wild antelope, buffalo, and eventually domesticated cattle brought by early pastoral societies. In this landscape of endless horizons and migrating herds, viruses could move quietly between animals, evolving over generations. Long before written history recorded its presence, the ancestors of the Rinderpest virus were likely circulating among these animals, waiting for the moment when human activity would carry them far beyond their original home. As human societies expanded, cattle became one of the most valuable forms of wealth in the ancient world. Herds moved with traders, nomads, and migrating communities. This movement created a powerful network of biological exchange. When infected animals joined new herds, the virus could spread rapidly across vast distances. Trade routes that carried salt, silk, and grain also carried disease unseen, unmeasured, and unstoppable. Military campaigns played an equally important role in this spread. Ancient and medieval armies depended heavily on animals for transport, food, and supply. When armies marched across continents, they rarely traveled alone. Behind the soldiers came long lines of cattle meant to feed the troops. When armies marched, cattle marched with them. And hidden among them, invisible to generals and kings, the virus traveled silently. Nomadic migrations and caravan networks further accelerated this movement. From the steppes of Central Asia to the markets of the Middle East and the cities of Europe, animals were constantly bought, sold, and transported. Each new herd created an opportunity for infection. Each journey opened another path for the virus. Slowly, over centuries, Rinderpest expanded its reach across continents. Some historians believe the disease followed the same pathways carved by conquering empires. As powerful states expanded their influence, trade routes grew longer, migrations intensified, and armies traveled farther than ever before. These expanding networks connected distant ecosystems in ways that had never existed in earlier history. Along these very same roads of conquest and commerce, the cattle plague moved quietly, linking distant regions through an invisible chain of infection. Human history is not shaped only by human diseases. Epidemics like plague or smallpox left visible scars on cities and populations. But history also contains quieter catastrophes, diseases that strike not the human body, but the animals that sustained human life. Sometimes the most destructive epidemics attack the very creatures upon which entire economies and food systems depend. When those animals disappear, the consequences ripple outward through society with astonishing force. For much of human history, cattle were the engines of agriculture. They pulled plows through heavy soil, transported goods between villages and markets, and provided the manure that fertilized crops. Their milk nourished families, and their meat sustained communities through harsh seasons. Remove cattle from this delicate system, and the structure of rural life begins to unravel. When cattle died, farming slowed or stopped entirely. Fields that once produced grain and vegetables remained unplowed and barren. Transportation systems collapsed as well. In a world without engines, cattle and oxen pulled the carts that carried food, firewood, and trade goods across long distances. Without them, villages became isolated, markets emptied. Trade networks that once connected regions gradually fell apart. Even the invisible foundation of agriculture, the manure used as fertilizer, vanished along with the animals that produced it. The disappearance of milk created another silent crisis. In many traditional societies, milk was one of the most reliable sources of nutrition, especially for children and the elderly. When herds vanished, villages suddenly lost an essential part of their daily diet. Malnutrition spread quietly through communities already struggling with economic collapse. This chain reaction transformed a livestock epidemic into a human disaster. When cattle vanished, entire food systems collapsed. Fields could not be plowed. Milk disappeared from villages. Trade slowed, hunger spread, and communities grew weaker with each passing season. And slowly, almost inevitably, famine followed. Rinderpest revealed a powerful truth about civilization. Human survival has always depended on a complex web of relationships with other species. When a disease strikes one critical part of that web, the effects spread far beyond the original infection. A virus that kills cattle can ultimately reshape economies, ecosystems, and the fate of entire human societies. In the late 19th century, one of the most devastating animal epidemics in history struck Africa. The year was 1890, and a silent biological invasion began moving southward across the continent. Carried by infected cattle introduced through colonial trade routes and military movements, the Rinderpest virus entered ecosystems that had never encountered it before. What followed was not merely an agricultural crisis, but a continental catastrophe that reshaped societies, landscapes, and human survival. The virus spread with astonishing speed. Herd after herd collapsed as the disease swept through cattle populations across eastern and southern Africa. In many regions, pastoral communities watched their entire herds die within months. The scale of destruction was unprecedented. Across southern Africa alone, more than 5 million cattle perished, wiping out one of the most essential sources of food, labor, and wealth for millions of people. But the epidemic did not stop with cattle. Wild animal populations also suffered enormous losses. Buffalo, antelope, and other grazing species were highly vulnerable to the virus. As Rinderpest moved through the landscape, wildlife numbers collapsed alongside domestic herds. Vast ecosystems that had once been filled with grazing animals suddenly fell silent. The human consequences were catastrophic. Entire pastoral economies collapsed almost overnight. Without cattle, communities lost their primary food source and their ability to cultivate land. Famine spread across large parts of the continent. In Ethiopia alone, historians estimate that starvation and social collapse killed nearly 1/3 of the human population. A disease of animals had triggered one of the worst humanitarian disasters of the 19th century. Yet the crisis extended even further, reaching deep into the natural environment. With the disappearance of millions of grazing animals, grasslands began to change dramatically. Without constant grazing, vegetation grew thicker and denser. In many areas, open grasslands gradually transformed into thorny bush landscapes. This ecological shift created the perfect habitat for a dangerous insect, the tsetse fly. The spread of tsetse flies introduced another deadly threat. These insects carry the parasite responsible for sleeping sickness, a disease that infects both humans and animals. As the flies multiplied within the new bush environments, sleeping sickness began spreading into regions where it had previously been rare. What had begun as a livestock epidemic was now triggering a chain reaction of ecological and medical crises. The African Rinderpest epidemic revealed a powerful and unsettling truth about the interconnected world of biology. A virus infects animals. Their disappearance alters the landscape. The landscape changes insect populations. Those insects carry new diseases into human communities. In a fragile ecological system, the chain reaction can be relentless. Animal disease leads to ecological transformation, and ecological transformation leads to human disease. When cattle disappeared, grasslands changed dramatically. For centuries, vast herds of grazing animals had shaped these landscapes in ways that were often invisible to the people who lived among them. Every day, millions of animals fed on grasses, trimmed vegetation, and moved constantly across the land. This continuous grazing maintained open grasslands and prevented certain plants and shrubs from taking over. In other words, cattle were not just part of the ecosystem, they were powerful ecological engineers. When Rinderpest wiped out enormous populations of cattle and wild grazing animals, this balance was suddenly broken. Without constant grazing pressure, grasses grew taller and thicker. Bushes and thorny plants that had once been kept under control began spreading rapidly across the land. Within a few years, entire landscapes began to transform. In some regions, open grasslands slowly evolved into dense thorn bush environments. These vegetation changes also altered the behavior of wildlife. Many grazing animals depend on open grasslands to survive, where they can easily find food and detect predators from a distance. As thorny bushes spread, these animals were forced to migrate, decline in number, or disappear entirely from certain regions. Predators followed their prey, reshaping entire food chains. The disappearance of cattle had triggered a cascade of ecological adjustments across multiple species. Perhaps the most surprising transformation occurred among insects. Dense vegetation created ideal habitats for many insect species that thrive in shaded, humid environments. Among them were disease-carrying insects that had previously struggled to survive in open grasslands. As vegetation grew thicker, these insects multiplied rapidly, expanding their territory into areas where they had once been rare. The chain reaction was remarkably simple, yet profoundly powerful. Less grazing meant more vegetation. More vegetation created new habitats for insects. Those insects could then carry parasites and diseases into new ecosystems and human communities. In this way, the disappearance of cattle did far more than change agriculture. It quietly reshaped entire ecosystems. Rinderpest reminds us that ecosystems are delicate systems of balance. Remove a single key species, and the consequences can ripple outward through plants, animals, insects, and humans alike. A virus that began inside the body of a cow ultimately altered landscapes, biodiversity, and the invisible biological networks that sustain life on Earth. For centuries, societies could only watch helplessly as Rinderpest devastated their herds. Farmers, herders, and rulers often interpreted the disease through superstition or religion, believing it to be a curse or divine punishment. Yet the scale of destruction eventually forced governments and scholars to confront a difficult truth. Understanding animal disease was not simply an agricultural concern, it was a matter of national survival. From this crisis emerged one of the most important scientific developments in agricultural history, the birth of modern veterinary science. In 18th century Europe, repeated outbreaks of Rinderpest threatened the agricultural backbone of entire kingdoms. Massive cattle deaths led to food shortages, economic collapse, and social unrest. Determined to prevent future disasters, governments began supporting the systematic study of animal health. In 1761, one of the first veterinary schools in the world was established in Lyon, France. Its mission was clear: to understand, control, and prevent devastating livestock diseases like Rinderpest. As veterinary science developed, new strategies emerged to slow the spread of epidemics. One of the earliest and most important was quarantine. Sick animals were isolated from healthy herds to prevent infection from spreading. This idea, now familiar in human medicine, was revolutionary at the time. It required coordinated policies, trained inspectors, and strict enforcement across rural regions. Animal inspection also became a critical tool in controlling disease. Markets, trade routes, and livestock transport were monitored carefully. Veterinarians and inspectors examined animals for signs of infection before they could be sold or moved to new locations. When outbreaks occurred, governments sometimes ordered the immediate slaughter of infected herds, harsh but effective strategy to stop the virus from spreading further. These policies were not easy to enforce. For many farmers, cattle represented their entire livelihood, and the loss of a herd could mean financial ruin. Yet slowly, governments began to understand the broader stakes. Protecting livestock was not merely about safeguarding animals. It was about protecting food supplies, economies, and the stability of entire societies. Governments slowly realized that protecting animals meant protecting civilization itself. The struggle against Rinderpest helped shape the foundations of modern veterinary medicine, disease surveillance, and agricultural policy. What began as a desperate response to a devastating epidemic would ultimately transform how humanity understands and manages animal health across the entire world. By the beginning of the 20th century, humanity had entered a new scientific era. Advances in microbiology were revealing the hidden world of viruses and bacteria, and scientists were beginning to understand how epidemics could be controlled. Yet Rinderpest still remained one of the most feared livestock diseases on Earth. Outbreaks continued to erupt across parts of Europe, Asia, and Africa, threatening food systems and rural economies. The battle against this ancient virus would now move from local struggles to a coordinated global effort. One of the most powerful weapons developed in this fight was vaccination. Scientists discovered that animals exposed to weakened forms of the virus could develop immunity, protecting entire herds from future outbreaks. Early vaccines were difficult to produce and distribute, but over time, researchers improved their effectiveness and stability. As vaccination campaigns expanded, millions of cattle across different continents were gradually protected from the disease. Yet vaccines alone were not enough. Controlling a disease that moved across borders required cooperation between nations. Governments began sharing scientific knowledge, coordinating vaccination campaigns, and establishing international monitoring systems. Disease surveillance became a critical strategy. Veterinarians and researchers carefully tracked outbreaks, identified infected regions, and responded quickly to prevent the virus from spreading further. Two major international organizations played a central role in this global effort: the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations and the World Organization for Animal Health. These institutions helped coordinate scientific research, support vaccination programs, and assist countries struggling with outbreaks. By connecting governments, laboratories, and veterinary experts around the world, they created a unified strategy against one of history's most destructive livestock diseases. In the late 20th century, this cooperation culminated in one of the most ambitious disease eradication programs ever attempted. Massive vaccination campaigns were launched across Africa and Asia. Surveillance networks monitored livestock populations with unprecedented precision. When outbreaks were detected, rapid response teams moved quickly to isolate and eliminate the virus. Slowly, year by year, the ancient cattle plague began to disappear from the world. In 2011, the world achieved something extraordinary. After decades of scientific research, international cooperation, and relentless dedication, Rinderpest, the virus that had haunted livestock and human societies for centuries, was officially declared eradicated. Across continents, from Africa to Asia, the ancient cattle plague that had reshaped ecosystems, economies, and human lives was finally gone. This eradication was historic. Only one other disease, smallpox, had ever been completely removed from the face of the earth. Unlike human diseases, which often involve complex social behaviors and hidden reservoirs, Rinderpest's eradication demonstrated the remarkable potential of veterinary science, vaccination, and global collaboration. It was a triumph not only for agriculture, but for the security of human societies dependent on animals. For millennia, Rinderpest had silently shaped human history. It caused famine, disrupted economies, altered ecosystems, and even facilitated the spread of other diseases. The eradication of this virus represents more than a scientific achievement. It is a symbolic moment, showing what humanity can accomplish when knowledge, cooperation, and perseverance come together in the service of life. A virus that haunted humanity for thousands of years was finally gone. And yet, the lessons it leaves behind are enduring. The deep interconnections between humans, animals, and ecosystems. The fragility of societies that depend on a single species. And the power of science and collaboration to change the course of history. The story of Rinderpest is not only about animals. It is a story about the fragile balance between humans, animals, and the ecosystems we share. For centuries, a single virus silently shaped human civilization, reminding us that our survival is intricately connected to the creatures that sustain us. When livestock died, societies faltered, economies collapsed, and landscapes transformed. Every herd lost was a lesson in how interwoven our fate is with the fate of the natural world. Modern science has completely changed the way we deal with such threats. Today, Rinderpest no longer exists in the wild thanks to vaccination campaigns, global surveillance, and veterinary research. The virus is officially eradicated, but the knowledge gained in this fight continues to shape livestock health worldwide. Modern veterinary approaches now include rapid diagnostic testing, cold chain vaccine delivery, biosecurity protocols, and continuous monitoring to prevent any resurgence of similar diseases. Yet the lessons extend far beyond veterinary science. Rinderpest reminds us that human well-being is inseparable from the health of the animals and ecosystems around us. Every species plays a role in the web of life, and disruptions to that web can have consequences that echo across centuries. The eradication of Rinderpest is a triumph of science, cooperation, and foresight, but it is also a warning. The balance of life is delicate, and our vigilance must be constant. When one species collapses, the consequences echo through the entire web of life. Today, the shadow of Rinderpest may have passed, but the invisible threads linking humans, animals, and ecosystems remain. It is a story that continues to teach us about resilience, responsibility, and the profound interconnectedness of all living things. Thank you for joining us on this journey through history, science, and the remarkable story of Rinderpest. If you enjoyed this video, please make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Your support helps us continue to bring these fascinating stories to life. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you won't miss our next episode, where we'll explore another hidden chapter in the history of humans, animals, and the world we share. Wishing you a healthy, curious, and inspired life. Stay safe, stay informed, and keep exploring the amazing connections around you.